Good evening. You're on the smoking section with Steve Helfer and our Stephen Helfer, whichever. Welcome. I always welcome your comments or questions. This is unfortunately, I think, the time of year when smoking becomes a little bit difficult because we can't smoke inside, and so many of us are exiled into the cold and the dark. But I really am very amazed at how resourceful and adaptable human beings are, and maybe especially smokers, because we have adapted to it. And I didn't think I could when I heard all of these smoking laws were pending and whatnot. I thought it would be just excruciating, but it's not pleasant. But I can live with it, and I have lived with it, and I'm happy to see all the other people who are living with it. Even people, I have a friend named Frank, I can't remember his last name, and he's unfortunately in one of those scooters, and he's in a building that is where smoking is banned, and he can lose his lease. And I see him on the street, and he always seems pretty contented, even in this bad weather and whatnot. But I really wonder what kind of society we want to have. It's funny because there was an article in the paper about people who are addicted to heroin or something like that who are going to jail, and there was a law case recently where they are, because of the Americans with Disability Act and so forth, they are entitled to drug treatment plans. And we keep being told that these kinds of terrible habits, drug habits, are a disease, as if people have no control over themselves and no control. It's just like catching a cold or something, and you all of a sudden become an addict. But when it becomes smoking, all the kind of stigma you can is heaped upon us. Uh, while they try to remove stigma from opioids and all that, we're stigmatized, and that's supposed to be a legitimate public health tool to coerce people to stop smoking. And again, even though people have stopped smoking to a large extent, I mean, it's down to 15% of adults. But of course, we don't really know how accurate that figure is. I think there's a lot of people who are buying cigarettes on the internet and who are going across state lines, and people who are, when they are queried as to whether or not they are smoking, they may say, well, oh, I don't smoke. No, I gave up smoking. But in fact, they are still enjoying tobacco and still getting the the solace, I should say, that they get from it. But it's interesting how, I mean, I'm not in favor of stigmatizing people with drug habits, people who are on heroin, etc. But it's interesting just how they are not supposed to be stigmatized, but smokers are supposed to be stigmatized, and smokers are supposed to be exiled into the streets and taxed and all manner of coercive measures. And we're all supposed to worry so much about uh, children smoking, and that we are kind of child proofing the whole country so that you can't buy cigarettes in pharmacies, for example, anymore in Massachusetts. You can buy all kinds of uh, pharmaceuticals that will get you addicted to opioids, or you can buy psychoactive medications that no one knows what the long-term effects are, and so many things that you could possibly uh, die of an overdose from. And but you can't buy cigarettes. Now, one thing that Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights is doing right now is we are having an email campaign, because even though people with electronic cigarettes, the electronic cigarette, the vapors, don't support us, we support them. because we think vaping is perfectly healthy and a person's right, or we approve of the liberty to vape. And of course, vaping essentially is just a way of getting nicotine and that's in water vapor that's slightly flavored. But recently, the FDA, under its director, its commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, uh, has proposed banning flavored vaping products, supposedly because a lot of younger people are taking to vaping. Now, to me, vaping is completely harmless. Nicotine itself is even people in the anti-smoking movement will agree that nicotine itself is harmless, and even though they say it's addictive, it certainly is not addictive in the classical sense of the word, because that term used to be used only for things that intoxicated you, that would perhaps get you in such a way that you might not be able to drive a car, or that you might beat your wife, or that you'd be unable to pass a test or operate dangerous machinery. So now, of course, the term is used very broadly, anything that becomes a strong habit. But I personally can't see any harm in teenagers vaping. I mean, it's just not going to harm them. It's a mild, if you want to call it an addiction or a habit, it could be a mild habit. So Scott Gottlieb said that the increase in teenagers vaping shocks his conscience. Again, such hyperbole and such sanctimony. Now, my good friend Michael McFadden says that a lot of teenagers, that this whole vaping thing is among teenagers is a statistical gimmick, and I've been following it. It seems to me that the actual numbers may be increasing, although I don't see teenagers vaping. I am told they are, and of course the number is high, but this is basically something that is completely harmless, and uh, so I don't think there is any problem there. I think it's like just creating a problem that doesn't exist, so that the powers that be can exercise their powers and control society in general and eliminate flavors. So again, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights has started an email campaign, and this is going to the FDA website, which is requesting public comments on the issue, and we have been emailing people and giving them a message that they can copy and paste and send to the FDA. Now, the FDA itself says that, well, it's better to write your own message and make it thoughtful, and I'm sure that is the case. But I'm also sure that getting many people to send a thoughtful message to the FDA that has been written by Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights has an effect. And it is difficult to get people to email. I think primarily they say to themselves, oh, well, this won't make a big difference. And of course, one email is not going to make a big difference. But if you consider the investment, I mean, you only invest about perhaps 2 minutes, 3 minutes of your time, and you are able to speak directly to a federal agency. I think the possible gain is much greater than the possible loss of a few minutes of your time. Yet I think we human beings are very often prisoners almost of inertia. We just can't get ourselves to do it, even if it's a small thing. And that is something that of course, is up to Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights to inspire people to do these small acts. One thing I think of in this regard was there was oh gosh, it had to be 10 years ago, there was a bipartisan immigration reform bill that looked like it was definitely going to pass, and everybody says it was going to pass and there was nothing anybody could do about it. But so many people emailed their representatives that just ordinary people just took a moment or two to send an email that the bill collapsed. Now, I'm not saying I agree. I personally think the bill would probably have been pretty good, but my point is that we have a lot more power than we think we have. And I think it's very easy for us to think that we don't have that power and therefore do nothing. And I think that every political act has a consequence, generally a good consequence. Now, it may not be the it may not be as big a consequence as you like, but it will make some difference. And of course, making some difference is literally infinitely better than making no difference, just whining or complaining to your friends about something. So I ask anybody, go to our Facebook page, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights. And today we have the link to the FDA website. The FDA itself is requesting public comments, and we have composed what I think is a very straightforward comment on the flavored e-nicotine e-cigarette question, and supported with there are references to all the statements that we make in it. And I would implore anybody out there listening to go to our Facebook page, get the link, and simply copy and paste and send the message. Of course, if you feel you want to write your own message, that's great too. It can be very short. It does not have to be frightfully intelligent. It can just be straightforward, your feelings. But here is an issue where the federal agency itself is asking for public comments. It's extraordinarily easy to make the public comments, and so there is no reason not to, and no reason to feel that you don't have the kind of political power that you do have. It may not be as powerful as you'd like it to be, but it's, again, literally infinitely better than doing nothing at all. On our Facebook page, we did report also that, for example, Washington, D.C. Did raise their cigarette taxes a whopping $2 a pack. And to me, this is really outrageous because a regressive tax, for example, is a tax that burdens poorer people more than affluent people. But this is not really this is worse than a regressive tax, because this is a tax that very much targets poor people and people with mental illness who have much higher rates of smoking than the affluent. This is a tax that doesn't just burden them more, it burdens them almost exclusively. And I know that, for example, Barack Obama, when he was president, he talked about how the importance of having broad-based taxes, taxes that affect everyone, not just on a particular minority or a single group of people. And this is a tax only on people who smoke. And it is being used for programs in the Washington, D.C. area that benefit everyone, yet only smokers pay for it. This is not the idea of taxation. This is not the democratic idea of taxation. I'm glad to hear that a lot of people are refusing to pay the tax, shopping in Virginia, where the state tax is 30 cents on a package of cigarettes, or Maryland, where the state tax is $3. But of course, when you say state tax, you also have to add the tax of the federal tax, and then often there's a sales tax added to it, and then there's also something called the Master Settlement Agreement, which is a de facto tax that had been extorted essentially from the tobacco companies. But as everyone knows, if a business is taxed, businesses are there for profit, and they simply pass the tax on to their consumers. So this is a tax that really, none of these taxes are paid for by cigarette companies. They're all paid for by us smokers. But I am glad to hear that a lot of entrepreneurs are selling loosies down in the DC area. And loosies, of course, are single cigarettes. And what these young entrepreneurs, and some of them not so young, do is I think they get a friend or they go to Virginia or Maryland, just across the border from DC, and they'll buy a carton of cigarettes at a much lower price, and then they'll sell the single cigarettes for 75 cents, seems to be the rate now of single cigarettes in Washington, D.C. And so that means if you sell 20 cigarettes at 75 cents, that's $15. And if you get a carton, let's say $8, so that's $15. So you make roughly $8 a carton, I guess. Let me just think, $8 a pack. And I think that's a really good sign. I would suggest that everybody in the DC area do whatever they can. This is just a tax very much like what we thought of as the tea tax here in Massachusetts, which we celebrate the Tea Party, where Massachusetts citizens, colonists, took all the tea and dumped it into the harbor because they felt that the tax that England had put on this tea was onerous and unjustified. And one of the ways that tyrannical governments rule is by taxing and trying to change people's behavior by taxing. And really, taxes are there to pay the government's bills. They're not there for the government to be able to coerce the citizenry. And that's a complete reversal now of what's going on, and where the government is supposed to control our behavior rather than vice versa. And again, I'm very happy that there are a lot of people in DC who are avoiding this tax. Now, it makes the tax in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, higher than the tax in every state, but not higher than the tax in certain cities, because certain cities have put their own tax on cigarettes in addition to the state tax. And those cities, as far as I know, the only two cities that have done that are New York and Chicago. And I wonder because, of course, the way to fight this is one way is not to vote in the kinds of people who will put these taxes on tobacco. And again, the other way, of course, is to do everything you can to avoid it by either buying loosies or going across lines and getting out of the. But I'm also disappointed. People like to talk, like I remember, again, President Obama would talk about how people would have each other's backs. So and so would have his back, or so and so would have someone else's back, in a sense that the citizenry kind of helps each other out. But I don't see anybody criticizing this outrageous, punitive, and unfair tax on smokers. It's really disappointing. But when there's only so much. We are human beings, and generally we tend to be rather selfish. So The average human being, if he sees somebody else getting taxed, even if it's grossly unfair, as long as he's not getting taxed, he's cool with it. So again, these taxes on tobacco products are not opposed by the general population because the general population doesn't pay them. Even those people who talk about how taxes should be broad based and fair, if they're not paying the tax, it no longer needs to be broad based and fair. And some people may decry that, but it just happens to be a reality. That's the way we are, and that's the way uh, human beings are, and there's not much we can do about it. But those people who always talk about how everything should be fair and that sort of thing generally fall short when it comes to, certainly in this case, with tobacco taxes and the people who pay them. Now, one thing the anti-smoking groups, of course, are very, very happy. But one of the reasons, of course, they're happy is that they probably get some of this tax money, like the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and some other organization called Breathe Free DC. They get money from the government, I think, at this point. So they always like to see taxes on smokers. But they say when you have these taxes, the smoking rate goes down and revenue increases. Well, one thing about the smoking rate is it's really difficult to determine because, again, as I said before, um, a lot of the times they are simply asking people, and how accurately people are reporting whether they smoke. I know that most people these days are going to say, "Oh, I don't smoke," even if they do smoke. Now, one guy down there who's an elderly man who does sell loosies reports that he's making $70 a day in profits, and that is really good. I think if you can make $70 a day selling loosies, I say more power to you. And the retailers, I feel sorry for them, but I'm more concerned about people who smoke and people who smoke who are not being impoverished by these high taxes. And it's funny because they talk about how addictive tobacco is, but then they say if you raise the tax 25 cents, uh, you will make all these people stop smoking. Well, if they really believed what they were saying about the addictiveness of tobacco, which of course I don't think they believe really, because so many millions of people have quit smoking. Really, the desire to smoke is a desire. It's not something that people have no control of. Even the Surgeon General reported in 1990 that about 40 million Americans had quit smoking, and of those Americans who quit smoking, of that 40 million, 90% had quit entirely on their own. So really, uh, those of us who continue to smoke do it as a matter of choice, not because we can't stop. And um, that makes it almost more onerous because they are trying to thwart our uh, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Um, and of course, there was this case in New York, I guess again about 10 years ago, where this individual who was selling loosies was put in a stranglehold by New York City police officers, and he ended up dying simply for the crime of selling single cigarettes. Now, you know, how dangerous is a single cigarette, and why shouldn't, if someone wants to sell me a single cigarette and I want to buy a single cigarette, who has the right to tell us that we cannot do this? Well, thank you for listening to the program. Again, we have a Facebook page, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights. I would encourage you to send an email, or not send an email, but post on the FDA's website. It will only take you about 90 seconds. And I would also recommend keeping abreast of these issues because there's a lot to this smoking and the war on smoking and the war on smokers, and support your local tobacco store like Levitt and Pierce, which is really probably at this point is one of the most important and great tobacco stores in the whole country. I certainly don't know of another store other than Peretti's, which is in Park Square. Uh, Either of those stores, you can get a very lovely selection of roll your own tobacco, which thankfully so far is taxed at a lower rate than commercial cigarettes, and I would say is really more satisfying. Uh, Thanks for watching the smoking section every Wednesday, 7 p.m. Good night.